Hello, welcome back to Bioclass Bites. In this video, we are going to talk about key concepts of disaster readiness and risk reduction. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like and share this video. Before we actually discuss the main topic of this video, I have several recommendations for you to check out. The first one is this video from National Geographic entitled Rare Footage of Some of the World's Worst Natural Disasters, linked in the description below. This one is another video from Vox entitled Why There's a Ring of Natural Disasters Around the Pacific. Okay, this one is very interesting and would review or recap everything that we've tackled in grade 11 about Earth and Life Science. This one is a news article from GMA News Online published in 2015. The Philippines' fourth most disaster-prone country in the world, from UN report. So as we gain more and more knowledge and understanding about disaster risk and management, I hope that as you read this article, you'll be able to apply everything that we have learned so far and see if we can derive more information and understanding from it. So again, linked in the description below. Another video from GMA News, the worst disasters that hit the Philippines from 2018 and 2015. So again, linked in the description below. I recommend that you watch this video and try to remember if you ever experienced any of these disasters, and try to remember how your family coped and survived those disasters. And finally, the essence of this entire video can be summarized from this TED Talk from Rachel Kite, entitled From Disaster Response to Disaster Prevention. So this video will set the mood for the entire series, and I hope you will find the time to watch her talk. Okay, this is very informative. This is recommended and required. Again, all the links are found in the description below. This concept map is taken from Teaching Guide for Senior High School on Disaster Readiness and Risk Reduction. So it shows us that the preparation for disaster risk management involves disaster risk reduction and disaster management. So disaster risk reduction tells us that in order for us to reduce the effects of disaster, we need to look into analysis and management of the different factors that constitutes a disaster. So that includes prevention. Okay, so that tells us the outright avoidance of the impacts of disaster. Okay, so this includes the intention to completely avoid potential impacts through action taken in advance. So to prevent the impacts of that particular hazard. Mitigation tells us the lessening or lessening of the impact. So one is to prevent, another is to mitigate or to lessen the impacts of those disasters. Adaptation tells us that it involves the adjustment of natural or human systems, adjustment of natural or human infrastructure in response to a possible effects of a disaster. So these three, prevention, mitigation, and adaptation, falls under disaster risk reduction. However, should disaster occurs, now we have disaster management. That includes preparedness. Okay, this involves the knowledge and capacities developed by governments, professionals and experts, recovery organizations, and communities and individuals that allows them to anticipate, respond, recover from a possible disaster, while response refers to the provisions of emergency services and public assistance during or immediately after a disaster. So preparedness for what's ever coming, response, okay, to provide assistance immediately after a disaster, and then recovery. So that involves the restoration and improvement where appropriate of facilities and livelihoods of those regions that are affected by that disaster. So preparedness, response, and recovery fall under disaster management. So once all of these are accomplished, then we can say that that particular city or nation or country has a very good disaster risk management program in place. To learn more about disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management, I recommend that you visit this page from Prevention Web and United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. All the links are found in the description below. So most of my quotations and most of my topics are actually derived from these websites and other recommendations. So you might want to check those out. So according to UNDRR, what is disaster risk reduction? So we have already talked about this in the previous videos on basic concepts that natural hazards are always present and they're always there. So there's no way for us to actually completely avoid it, but the best thing that we can do is to lessen the exposure and vulnerability of the people against those hazards. Um, so historically, dealing with disasters in the past mostly focus on emergency response. So how are we going to respond after the disaster? However, towards the end of the 20th century, okay, modern period, we are now more and more geared towards reducing and managing the conditions of the hazards. Again, reducing the exposure and vulnerability of the people. So not anymore what to do after, but what to do before and during and after a particular hazard, so that to minimize the risk and disastrous effects. So again, no, in the past, the disaster actions mostly focus on response, but nowadays we are geared towards reducing and managing hazard exposure and vulnerability, so that we can actually prevent more losses, okay, or lessen the losses and deaths and reduce the impacts of those disasters. So since we cannot reduce or completely avoid those natural hazards, what we need to do is to reduce the vulnerability and exposure of the people, okay, of the citizens. So that includes identifying and reducing the drivers of risk, okay? And sadly, those disaster risks are results of poor planning, poor economic and urban development planning choices and practices. Okay, we've seen that here in the Philippines. Degradation of the environment. So these are the causes or drivers of risk. Poor planning and urban development choices, degradation of the environment, okay? Poverty, extreme poverty, inequality, and of course, we've just talked about this, climate change. So all of this can actually worsen the effects of natural disasters should they occur, okay, because they add up to the exposure and vulnerability of the people. So the goal of disaster risk reduction is not anymore to respond to the disaster, but to actually reduce the hazard, exposure, and vulnerability of the people and address these causes of risk: poor planning, degradation of the environment, poverty, and climate change. So this quote, we've mentioned this before, there's no such thing as natural disaster. Okay? We only have natural hazards. So disaster only happens when we fail to prepare for the hazards. Okay? When we fail to adapt and to mitigate those hazards. So um, disasters usually follow hazards. And again, it depends on the impact on the hazard if we fail to make choices on how to mitigate and address those hazards. So these choices relate to how we grow our food, where and how we build our homes. Are we using um, um, updated and strong type of materials? Are we using hard materials to build our homes? Are we up to codes when it comes to engineering protocols and fire codes? Okay, what kind of government we have, what actions do they take, how our financial system works, and most importantly, what we teach in schools. That's why disaster risk management as a subject, I think, no, personally, I think should not only be taught in grade 12, but should be taught at every level in depending on the complexity or the ability of the students to understand the lessons. But this should not just be taught on one grade level, but across levels in a comprehensive manner, in a comprehensive approach. So each decision that we make us more or less vulnerable to disaster or more resilient towards them. So there's no such thing as this natural disaster. Disasters only happen if we fail to address those hazards. So again, as a review, we've talked about this in the previous video series on basic concepts. So no such thing as natural disaster. We just have natural hazards. We just have volcanic eruptions. We just have earthquakes. We just have tsunami. We just have hydrometeorological hazards. All of them occur in nature, naturally. Disaster only happens if we fail to prepare for them. So in order to prepare for them, we have to make choices. Okay? As a family, as a locality, as a nation, as a species, as to where we inhabit the land, how we build our houses, our homes, and our infrastructure, and what research we should do in order to know more about the landscape of our regions. So no such thing as natural disaster. We just have to make choices, and then of course reduce the exposure of the citizens and reduce their vulnerability. Okay, so disaster risk is a combination of the hazard, exposure of the people near that hazard, and their vulnerability. And finally, should we fail to prepare for those hazards and address exposure and vulnerability, death, loss, and damage is actually the result of that, right? So if we want to lessen death, loss, and damage, we want to increase the resilience of the citizens, also lessen their exposure and vulnerability. Now, this one is a video from United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, their introduction to DRR and resilience. You could check this out. I'll provide the link in the description below. Now let us clarify DRR and DRM. So DRR, disaster risk reduction, is a policy making procedure. So disaster risk reduction mostly refer to the policies or the laws or the procedures or the protocol in place. So this is the policy. Okay? DRM, disaster risk management, is the implementation of those policies. Okay? This is the action taken by all stakeholders. So policy, those are the disaster risk reduction laws and procedure and protocol. So to take that into action or to use that or to implement that is the disaster risk management. Okay? So it describes the DRM, it describes the actions that aim to achieve the objective of the disaster risk reduction policies. Now, this one is another important thing, no? Although we've mentioned this before, having disaster risk if a community experiences a disaster after a natural hazard, it is an indicator of poor development or poor planning, poor choices. So reducing disaster risk requires integrating the DRR, the policy, and putting that into action, into DRM, into management practice. Okay, so again, DRR, risk reduction, that's the policy, those are the laws, those are the procedure. If you put that into action, if you implement that, then that's disaster risk management. This is a world map from Our World in Data that shows us the death rate from natural disasters as of 2017. This is the annual number of deaths from all forms of natural disaster per 100,000 people. So we have several countries, okay, that ranges from 1 to possibly 1,000 deaths per 100,000 people. So countries such as Mexico, some Caribbean islands, Colombia, Peru, Chile, Mauritania, Niger, Congo, okay, I think this is Iran, okay, Greece, India, Bhutan, okay, Mongolia, some countries in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, um, uh, Cambodia, I think. Okay, so we have several countries that experience death or the citizens died from natural disasters. So if you want to read more about this, you can visit our World in Data. So most of the world efforts are directly towards um, reducing the vulnerability and exposure of the citizens while building up their resilience, okay, or their ability to adapt and survive those disasters. So one thing that we should be looking into when we evaluate a community is to check their intensive and extensive risks. So extensive risk refers to the risk that the citizens could experience from with low severity but quite a frequent disaster, okay, or quite frequent disasters. So for example, here in the Philippines, it's quite frequent for us to experience typhoons and flooding, okay, based on our location. So that's considered an extensive risk. Intensive intensive risk is used to describe for high severity based from low frequency disasters, or it only happens not that once or just not that frequent. Okay, in other words, so extensive, low severity, but it happens all the time. Intensive risk, it doesn't happen all the time, but when it does happen, it causes a lot of damage. So intensive risk is usually associated with major hazards such as a massive earthquake or a volcanic eruption. While extensive risk, usually these are the risks that commonly are experienced by a nation or community. So in order to address those type of risk, we need to build up the resilience of a system or a community. So that refers to the ability of a community to expose to a hazard, to resist, absorb, accommodate, and eventually recover from that hazard in a timely and efficient manner. So identify the risks, then build up this resilience of a community. Those are the goals to prevent all these deaths. So we have here an image, an example of construction of a retaining wall to limit flooding in Afghanistan. So this one would mostly address extensive risk if they are already anticipating flooding, okay, flooding in their community. So how do we build resilience? So we know that we have to identify the intensive and extensive risk, and then we need to build up resilience. How do we do that? So number one, anticipate risk. Understand and assess the risk that your community would most likely experience. Okay, that's why in one of your assignments, you were tasked to come up with a hazard map of your home so that you can assess the risk of your homes. Number two is to prepare to adjust. Use tools to support decision making in the face of uncertainty of future risks. Okay, that's why you're also tasked to come up with the family evacuation map because that's the goal. How will you prepare to adjust in case of a disaster? Then number three, share and learn. Okay, share and learn what you know, what you've learned from this lesson, what you've learned with your family evacuation map in order to improve people's flexibility to deal with different challenges. Okay, we have a lot of families that already have a family evacuation plan, but we also have families who do not have family evacuation plan. So it's important for us to share what we know, not just with our immediate family, but if it's possible with all our relatives as well. Number four is to integrate sectors, promote greater dialogue and coordination across sectors and discipline. Okay, so this does not just involve the local government unit or the national government, but also the different, for example, the different departments, such as Department of Education, Department of Social welfare and development and all that. Even the DPWH should also be involved as they're the ones maintaining the public roads and all that. That include the most vulnerable in building up resilience. So manage risk across levels, connect decision making, and consider the weakest part of the system, not just part of the country, weakest part of the country or weakest part of the city, even the weakest part of your family or the weakest part of your evacuation plan. How do we address those who will need the most? Okay, so small island developing states. Okay, so those are islands mostly found in sea or in the Pacific or whatever. And low middle income countries continue to lack resilience to disaster risk. Okay, that's why more and um, more and more charity or more and more donations should go towards those low to middle income countries. Okay, so because risk and systems are dynamic, resilience should be thought of as a process rather than a simply outcome. Okay, so preparation to adjust and sharing must always be continuously updated. Okay, this involves learning, adaptation, and anticipation and improvement in basic disaster risk management. Now, the best way to come up with disaster risk reduction policies and proper implementation of those into disaster risk management is to use science and in decision making. And I'm glad to read that the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction published this report in 2013 entitled Using Science for Disaster Risk Reduction Report of the UNISDR Scientific and Technical Advisory Group. Okay, you can access this. I'll provide the link in the description below. So they had a lot of case studies there, but I chose this one because it's very timely with what we are experiencing right now. So this one is a case study of rubella syndrome or entitled Preventing Congenital Rubella Syndrome, Health Disaster Risk Reduction Through Rubella Vaccination. Okay, so the problem was that if a woman contracts or if a pregnant mother contracts rubella during her pregnancy, or also known as German measles, her unborn baby could also become infected. Okay, so the mother may experience the mild symptoms or mild illness, while the unborn baby will most likely suffer major birth defects. Those would be deafness, blindness, heart defects, and blood disorders. So you can see here an image of a newborn baby with microcephaly or small head size. Okay, so severe learning disabilities can also occur, and these may worsen throughout the life of that baby and can also be associated with the deformities of the skull, okay, as we've seen here. In some cases, the unborn baby will die from infection. So what is rubella? So rubella is actually an infectious disease caused by a virus. It spreads from person to person through sneezing and coughing. And this disease is actually very dangerous, so much so that outbreaks of rubella in the 1960s are actually considered epidemic, okay? Epidemic. So in the United States alone, approximately 11,000 babies died in 1960s and 20,000 babies were born with birth defects. So how did science solve or eventually solve this concern? So in the first half of the 20th century, so that's between 1901 to around 1940s, people were not yet aware that there's a link between rubella and birth defects. Okay, so they have not yet established that. However, in 1941, an Australian eye doctor named Dr. Norman Gregg was able to discover accidentally, through overhearing mothers that said that they had rubella when they were pregnant, and then that resulted into their children being born with eye problems. So he reviewed the records, he checked about it, he researched about it, and he was able to show in his work that having if the mother had a rubella in early pregnancy, it could cause serious birth defects in babies, as mentioned here. Um, so that was actually a great discovery in 1940s. This allowed people to take notice and take action against it. So that happened in 1941. So in 1969, a vaccination to prevent rubella became first available. And in 1969, the world now has a way of preventing harm and preventing babies being born with these deformities. Um, so, so, so this map shows us countries using rubella vaccine. Okay, and countries meeting World Health Organization criteria for rubella vaccine introduction as of 2009. So as you can see, majority of the countries in the world already have um, rubella vaccine for their babies. So was it able to make a difference? Did Dr. Greg made a difference? Yes, of course. Um, so the Pan American Health Organization aimed to eliminate rubella by 2003 and eventually the congenital rubella syndrome by 2010. So the number of World Health Organization using states using rubella containing vaccine grew from 40% to 67% by 2009. Okay, so there's an increase as of 2009. So rubella has been eliminated in the World Health Organization region of the Americas, and their experience, the country's experience, was able to be a guide was able to be turned into a guiding protocol for the rest of the countries, okay, for the rest of the countries, which eventually, of course, successfully eliminated rubella in their countries, okay. So the lessons identified include high-level commitment and partnerships, link political commitment with technical strategies, use proven surveillance tools, recognize outstanding performance, and provide ongoing training for surveillance staff. Okay, so they were able to address that, and this is now what we have nowadays. Um, so Greg's scientific work, so that was the doctor in 1951, has saved countless lives and prevented disability, family tragedy, and economic loss around the world. However, we still have the congenital rubella syndrome in some parts of the globe that do not have rubella vaccine. So eventually, eventually as time goes by, hopefully all of these countries will have good and excellent rubella vaccine programs. So that's just one application of science that was able to address this disaster from happening. Okay. So this report from UNISDR, Scientific and Technical Advisory Group, they had other case studies on how science was able to save a lot of people from disaster, okay, through disaster risk reduction. So you could check those out. Again, linked in the description below. Now, I chose that case study because it talks about a medical issue that was addressed through vaccination, through scientific method. And nowadays, now this is what we are experiencing right now. So we are um, still having the COVID pandemic is still raging on, and this is today's February 26, right? 26 or 27, January 27, 2021. And here in the Philippines, we do not have yet the vaccines for COVID, and we have several people who have undergone vaccination, but not for the mass, not for the regular citizens. And I it's important to note all the contributions of the medical personnel, of the researchers, of the researchers, and of the scientific experts in coming up with those vaccines. And eventually, hopefully, we will be able to overcome this COVID the same way we overcome rubella in 1960s. So if you want to, this one is a video from Kyrgyzstan, the coronavirus explained and what you should do. I'll provide the link in the description below. That ends our video. I hope you learned something new. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like and share this video. Till next time, goodbye.